Well, hello and welcome along to another We Happy Few 506 podcast. I'm by myself today. Doug is doing something family based, which means I think he's been press ganged into doing the dreaded airport runs for his family. But I'm not entirely alone because I have the beautiful Jared Frederick with me. Jared, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Good. Where are you?
I am in beautiful central Pennsylvania where I reside.
You reside in beautiful central Pennsylvania. I am, just to talk about myself, I am in the mountains in North Carolina, near Asheville, and I'm seeing an old friend of mine who used to be a sound recordist on a kid show I used to be in, and he lives completely off grid up in the mountains, and it is incredible. So I do apologize if my Wi-Fi gets a bit stuttery or whatever. Um, Also, I'm a little tired because he did that thing because he's also a builder. He did the thing all my builder friends do. They invite me to stay, and the first thing they do is go, right, we're going to work tomorrow. So I've been shoveling grit and stones all day in the baking heat. So I'm a little bit discombobulated.
In some ways, it's very appropriate because Dick Winters would also go into the mountains above Asheville, North Carolina, before he joined the
No.
506 Parachute Infantry Regiment.
Oh my goodness, what a great segue. Tell me all about that.
When he was
Or did you
stationed
just do
at when he was
that?
stationed at Camp Croft in neighboring South
Yeah.
Carolina, he would go to Asheville on his weekend leaves. And there was nothing that he
Well,
liked more than going on horseback rides up in the mountains where you are right now.
you're kidding me. Oh my goodness me. Is there a place I should go whilst I'm here? Like, I mean, obviously I'm up in the mountains, but is there any like place he would frequent that I can maybe take pictures of or?
One place that he would go to visit and one place that he would go horseback riding are the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, which are located right there in Asheville. So I think that's as close as I can get you. Other than that, I don't have too many specifics.
Well, it's not a big place. So, all right. So I'm breaking and entering onto the Biltmore estate,
It's open as
blaming
a
author,
museum. You're fine.
blaming author Jared Frederick. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for telling me that. How serendipitous. That's incredible.
And in
Anyway,
Asheville is where he actually met his wartime pen pal, Dieta Alman. That is where she was from.
really, this
Yes.
is so unexpected. You've thrown me completely. Um, so anyway, we should talk about the book, Into the Cold Blue. I'm gonna dance around a little bit, but I'll start with just saying, how's it been received?
We're very happy about it. And one of the most rewarding things for me is to
Yes.
see a 100-year-old man with a sense of purpose. And I think
Yeah, that's
that's what this
wonderful.
book has done. He's
Right.
very eager and anxious to share his story, to go out in public, to do interviews wherever possible. And he's
Wow.
he's just a dynamo of energy. And any of us would be blessed to have an ounce of the energy and the zeal that he has at a century old.
Yeah, because when you were saying that, my first thought was that sounds a bit tiring. Not sure I'd be up for that. And I'm literally half his age. How did you meet this man?
A mutual friend introduced us, a mutual friend who was associated with Penn State University, where I work.
Yeah.
And over the years, she had interviewed and facilitated reunions with a number of 8th Air Force veterans. And
Right.
I had met several of these gentlemen over the years, but our exchanges were always somewhat passing and very brief. And
Right.
over the past few years, I've made more of an effort to reach out to some of those gentlemen and to hear their stories firsthand, because none of us are going to be around forever. And about 2 years ago now, I met John Homan, who's my co-author of Into the Cold Blue. And after about 35 minutes of speaking with him, I said, John, I think your story is worthy of a book. And he said, well, we better get started because I have an expiration date. And that and
There's no
that
better
was
forward to a book.
That was the beginning of the quest. And we did about 15 separate recorded interviews that became the
Right.
foundation for the narrative. Lucky for us, he had written a number of articles and very brief reminiscences over the years. In addition to that, he kept all of his official records and his documentation. He had his unit history book. He had dozens of historical photos. And for me, that's just like catnip for
I was
historians.
trying to say catnip,
Uh,
yeah.
so all of that was incredibly helpful. And to make it even more rich was the fact that I was able to locate the correspondence or reminiscences of 3 of his 9 crewmates on his B-17. And so
No way.
it became not only a story about him, but it became a story about also the men with who he served. So we hope that for readers, it will paint not only a personal portrait, but become a touchstone to get we hope, a very good insight into what it was like to be an airman during the Second World War.
And is it his narrative? Is it like a first person narrative, or did you distill the interviews into your own sort of write them yourselves? You know.
It's written in first person,
Excellent.
and all of that is based off of our interviews and his previous writings. And both John and his family very thoroughly looked over it to make sure that I was maintaining his voice, that I didn't stray off course. And I did once or twice, and they
Right.
corrected me. And,
Nicely, or did you get chided?
it was tough love. I think that's the best way
Oh,
to put it. It became a stronger narrative and a better historical autobiographical work as a result, though. So uh, John thoroughly went through it, as did his daughter and son-in-law, who, luckily for me, were both professional editors in their professional lives.
it
So
really lined up for you, didn't it?
it was perfect. John lives about 45 minutes away from me, so it was an easy commute. It was easy to reach out to him, and it was an incredibly rewarding experience.
Wow. And how? I mean, this is kind of a tricky question, but how does his first person narrative differ from the way that you would write it? Has he just got a sort of? Is it just like a 1940s way of talking and thinking, or where were you getting picked up? I'm just interested.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I suppose an actor might think the same way. Yeah, how can you
Well, this
get
is why
into
I'm interested.
a
Yeah, yeah.
person's mind? Um, and I think it helps that I've read so many World War II letters and firsthand accounts from the 1940s.
Yeah.
My first book on the Second World War is Dispatches of D-Day. And for that book, I went through 150 American and international newspapers, and I transcribed 300,000 words in firsthand accounts of the Normandy invasion. And then I distilled what I thought were the best and most revealing of those accounts and molded them into a narrative form. And so having that sort of context, having that sort of perspective, I think in hindsight helped me get into how a person in the 1940s thought and reacted to their world and the people around them. I hope that
Yeah,
suitably answered your question.
it does, and I'm probably going to nerd out about it even more because they're depression babies, so they're just harder than we are for a start. I mean, they grew up and had it really, really tough, hard and uncompromising. So I don't know. I'm just fascinated, like how they sort of like think is so much different in that short space of time. How that we've sort of become so different to that particular generation and the way they thought and spoke.
I think, despite the fact that social media often brings us together, and it brings us together in the way that you and I are
Mhm.
speaking right now, ideas of family, neighborhood, and community were more significant to people who grew up in the 1930s and the 1940s, I think.
Right, okay.
You couldn't connect with the broader world in the way that you and I can right now. And therefore, the people who were around you were everything. They were your cocoon, they were your safety net. Uh, you were dependent upon your survival, dependent upon the people who lived around you. And I think that is something substantially different today. We can live next door to a person for years without knowing their first or last name in some
Yeah,
cases. And so I think that is one of the major worldview differences that separates us from 80 years ago.
yeah, very well put. That and humility as well. Um, so I got a message from your long-time cohort, Mr. Erik Dorr, who was going to pop on, but apparently doesn't like you very much, so he didn't. He said, and I'm quoting here, huge congratulations on the book. He has his copy, which arrived whilst he was in Europe.
Very good. I look forward to
And
hearing his thoughts on it next time I see him.
yeah, he's going to send it back full of red ink, I think he decided to do. Yeah, he and I were we just did an Easy Company tour. So we were on tour for 2 weeks together, going from Holborn up to the Eagle's Nest.
I saw the
And
photos.
you saw the photos. He insisted on. He just put plug tours exclamation mark as well. So at this point, I have to also tell you casually, but clearly plugging the tours as well, that we're going to do a 7-day Normandy one. We're going to do a Bulge one, perhaps, and he wants to do a Third Reich one and do all that Nuremberg stuff and everything, which is fascinating and brilliant. I'm not entirely sure what I bring to any of those things, but maybe we'll have Jared Frederick travel with us instead.
I would very much enjoy that. I would love the opportunity to tag along sometime and share some of my insights. Something that I would very much like to do is to travel with you gentlemen to see all of the air bases in the UK and
Well, that was my next thing. I was like,
yeah,
we've got some Masters of the Air
yeah,
tours coming. And I was like,
yeah.
I tell you who
And
would be really good on that would be Jared Frederick tours.
now I would love to do some compare and contrast as to
Yeah.
how the air war has been depicted in cinema. I can certainly talk about my book and my relationship with John and how that correlates with what we sometimes see in the movies, and
Yeah.
very much so. We wrote the book Into the Cold Blue before Masters of the Air came out, and having taken on that project with John allowed that series to resonate with me all the more because the things that I was seeing and hearing, I immediately connected with his experiences. Because indeed, whether you were flying in a B-24 or a B-17 or a Lancaster bomber, there were certain universal themes: the cold, the perpetual fatigue, the inherent dangers. It didn't matter what plane you flew or what nationality you were. To be an airman in Europe, it was the same characteristics regardless of what uniform you wore.
Yeah. And I think just for me personally, I mean, I'm I've always been a history nerd. I've always been fascinated uh, by World War One, World War Two, and all this stuff. My personal thoughts on the matter were that all the brutal stuff happened on the ground. And it wasn't until Masters of the Air and then talking to, Matt Mabe from 100th Bomb Group Foundation, there you go, and you start to realize just how brutal the air war was and just your chances of survival they're just minuscule. It was just terrifying.
Especially early on,
Yeah.
before they adjusted to some of the learning curves. It got a little bit less precarious later on in the war, but certainly that wasn't assured. So yeah, absolutely. It was a completely different type of war because these were men who often never saw the enemy. It
Yeah.
was, they were these black mushrooms of death that were sprouting in the air that claimed their lives, or these small specks, these enemy aircraft moving in at closing speeds of 600 miles per hour. So it was the stuff of nightmares. It was nightmare fuel. There's really no other way to put it.
Yeah. How do you feel about Masters of the Air as a series? How they tackled the book, how they tackled the subject material? It's a tricky ask. I mean, I think it's a trick. I think they did incredibly well with what is a tricky ask.
I enjoyed Masters of the Air immensely. And on our YouTube channel, Real History, REEL, as in a film reel, we
No,
did an episode by episode breakdown, much in the same way that we did a Band of Brothers, separating fact from fiction here and there. And I would say, and we recently interviewed John Orloff, and we'll
oh yeah,
be
cool.
airing that video in the very near future. But as I told him, and he acknowledged that things are condensed, storylines are merged, certain things are omitted. But despite all of that, there's hardly an episode in the series that isn't rooted in reality. I didn't feel that I was ever once being lied to when I was watching
No,
Masters of the Air.
or romanticized or
It
anything like
was
that. Yeah,
it was very truthful.
yeah,
And even if it wasn't 100% accurate, I knew that these things weren't merely a figment of somebody's imagination.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's. I think it's one of those. I think it's one of those shows that's going to grow. We've had a lot of the Masters of the Air cast on our podcast, and they're an incredibly erudite set of young men. Real credit to themselves on the show, unlike us from Band of Brothers, which a ragged crew we are.
I don't think you give
But
yourself enough credit.
but I always say the same thing to them, and I think the show is going to grow. I think it's going to grow and grow and grow. I think it's sort of like when it landed, there was a sort of history community that were just ready to eat it because you've got to point out the fact that this B-17 didn't do this, and they didn't fly in formation like this, and all that ridiculous garbage. And then there's a lot of other people who just didn't know anything about the stories. They didn't know about the war in the air. It was all sort of everything happened on the ground. And I think it has really hooked people in. And I've just noticed the social media posts every time we put one out on Masters of the Air, it's growing and growing and growing. And I think that the story will grow. And so basically what I also wanted to say to you was, what was it like having Apple put a $250 million production together to promote your book?
That isn't what I had in mind, but it was a lovely coincidence.
Isn't it just?
Yes. Although there are slight differences because John piloted a B-24, not a B-17. I don't think any B-24s even appeared in Masters of the Air. But if people are inclined to pick up a book about the 8th Air Force after seeing Masters of the Air to learn more about the experience, then well, I do have a good one right here for
What's
you.
it called? I can't quite see it in the lens. Put it close to the lens. What's it called again?
It,
There it is.
yep, Into the Cold Blue. And that is John right there, age 20,
Yeah.
having just got his
Wow.
wings.
Wow. Did he still look great at 100? Because Brad Freeman, and I toured with Brad Freeman, and he was 95 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he still looked money, man. He still had the cheekbones and the jawline. He was ramrod straight. He was incredible.
John is much the same way. He's not willing to travel far distances. I think he knows his limitations and he doesn't want to risk anything. But the man has a better suntan and complexion than I do. So
Right. Well, you are an author. You never see this like day.
So he's doing mighty fine.
Wow, that's incredible. So when you were doing all the research and doing all the interviews, how long does that take, by the way? Just to get everything together, to the whole process, in fact, from getting everything together to putting it down on paper. What's the timeline?
The timeline?
Yeah.
It was over the spring, summer, and autumn of 2022 is when we did the interviews.
Right.
And then there was about a close to year-long process of fusing it all together, writing it, editing it, cleaning it up, before it was handed over to the publishers for them to clean it up further, do the formatting, the printing, the distribution. It's like an onion. It's a very multi-layered process that takes a lot of time. So
It's like the reverse of peeling an onion. You have to put the onion back together again.
I suppose so. Yeah. But it was and sometimes I had to ask the difficult questions. I felt obliged as a historian. I asked him, how did you feel about dropping bombs on people, on
And what to say,
cities
because
and
I'm
factories?
always, yeah, I'm always interested in the PTSD that these men had and how it differed from being on the ground and living with exactly what you've just said, dropping bombs on cities. I mean, I watched a documentary recently when it was it the bombing of Hamburg? Correct me if I'm wrong here.
Hmm.
I think firebombed Hamburg, and the guy is being interviewed, and he was saying next night they were told to go back again
Mm.
because there were 3,000 people, 3,000 women and kids holed up in a post office. And he was
Hmm.
like, we've reduced it to the ground. There's nothing there. And they're
Yeah.
like, oh, we need to go back. And he just said, we're supposed to be the good guys.
Hmm. Yeah,
So he
he
does it.
he uh he in short said that I did what I was ordered to do, and there was
Right.
really little other option. Uh,
That's exactly what
he,
he interviewed in the document said exactly after that, exactly the same thing.
and he he would actually get out his log books and his papers, and he said nowhere on this list was I ever ordered to bomb a church or a school or a hospital. Every single target was a submarine pen, a factory, an air base, a railroad marshaling yard. He said, I never deliberately targeted civilians. And even if I was ordered to do so, I would have to put it out of my mind because I had no choice. If we didn't do our job, there were immense consequences. If you refuse to bomb a target, that's reason for court martial or prison or demotion at the very least. So it's I'm all about getting into the gray areas of the
Yeah.
Second World War, and I think Masters of the Air did that brilliantly because at one time Harry Crosby's character essentially says, in order to defeat evil, you have to embrace the very sort of evil that you are trying to extinguish, and that's war in a nutshell.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, that's the complexity of it, and
I know.
so
Sorry to interrupt you, but your point. I am following on from your point, but I mean, just been on a tour recently in Normandy, and obviously we were talking about some of the massacres and that sort of thing, SS massacres, and then we went. You go to the D-Day Experience Museum, and I think it's Colonel Wolverton. I'm not sure it's the hologram talking to you.
that's
Uh,
yeah, Bob
he,
Wolverton.
yeah, yeah, and he says no prisoners tonight. So you're sanctioning no prisoners. So if someone surrenders, you're just going to shoot them. So it's like you are embracing the same kind of mentality.
Hmm. Yeah, and it gets that's a good segue to think about people like Ronald Speirs and the many
Yeah.
mysteries that surround him that Erik Dorr and I tried to unravel.
Before
And
we get into that,
yeah,
before
sure.
we get into the Ronald Spears and your book, there's one question I wanted to ask you about Into the Cold Blue, and that was, and I mentioned it before, but we got into this great discussion. What was the one story that John told that stuck the hairs on the back of your neck up that you were just like, that's incredible?
Yeah. There's two that come to mind, and they're both amazing and horrific in their own right. On his second mission, July 7th, 1944, uh, his bomb group, the 489th, really went through the meat grinder. It was a truly eye-opening moment for him. And one of the other bombers in his outfit suffered a direct hit from flak on the nose of the plane, and it blew out the glass, and it just looked like a piece of shredded cheese, if you will. And additionally, some enemy fire struck the top turret of the B-24 that it came down to fly right beside them. And John said that the turret gunner was just eviscerated, and his blood was smeared all the way from where the turret was to the tail of the plane. John said it was just one massive streak of red that the slipstream of the wind took
Of course.
back across the entire body of the plane. And so he said that was his second mission. And he had 32 more to fly after that. And he said it left quite an impression.
Wow.
There was another mission that took place September 18th, 1944, the day after the 101st Airborne drops into Holland. And he was, among many other groups, were tasked with dropping supplies to paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division who had landed in Holland. And so this was something that was very new to them. They were accustomed to dropping bombs from 4 miles up, and now they were dropping supplies from 500 feet. And they took enemy ground fire, machine gun fire, which was also something new to them. And he said, right after we dropped our supplies to the paratroopers, he said everything seemed to go wrong at once. 2 of their engines failed. The hydraulics in the plane went out. All the atomized hydraulic fluid filled the entire plane with this fog. He said, I couldn't see my co-pilot sitting next to me. That's how thick the smoke was inside the plane. Their tail was shot out. The plane was just riddled with bullet holes. And all of this is happening at 500 feet. There's no room for error. They are flying at almost treetop level.
Yeah.
And somehow they were able to gain some elevation. They were able to figuratively crawl back to England, and they worked their way to an emergency airstrip, which was twice as long as a traditional airstrip back on their home base. And so 2 of their engines were out. They go to land, and as they get closer, they see that there's another B-24 that is just off the runway that has crashed and that is on fire. And they have to miss that burning plane on the ground as they are about to crash land. And so they go in on the approach, they go to land, and they find out that one of their tires have been shot out as well. And there was no way for them to see that until they were landing. And so they're literally shaking like this on the wheels of the plane, just waiting and hoping for this thing to stop before it erupts in a massive fireball. And they can smell fuel, like one spark can send them up like a Roman candle. And so they finally grind to a halt. And they said they ran like hell until they could run no more to get away from that plane. And amazingly, it didn't blow up, and every single man aboard survived. But that was the end of their plane, and shortly thereafter, they received a replacement plane. And he said that was the closest call that he ever had in the war.
Goodness me. That's incredible, isn't it?
It is.
That is incredible. Wow. Well, I guess we should talk about Ron Speirs, speaking about incredible characters, because you also co-authored with my good buddy Erik Dorr, Fierce Valor. That's the Ron Speirs that did Hang Tough with Dick Winters. So I guess my question is: so you wrote Hang Tough, um, and you're talking about a man who is very black and white, has a
Mm.
very strong moral compass, very strong-minded man, a great leader, and then you go from that to writing Fierce Valor, where you've got some guy where there's quite a lot of grey area, isn't
Absolutely. And I've spoken to veterans of the Second World War as well as current veterans, all of whom are familiar with Ronald Speirs in one form or another. And they all essentially say the same thing, that despite the controversy and despite the gray areas that you allude to, when you're in a combat situation, there's really no better person to have beside you than
there?
somebody
Oh,
like
absolutely.
Ronald Speirs. A determined, calm, confident go-getter who, in some cases, is not afraid to cross the line, and that comes at a price. But when you are in instinctual survival mode, they would pick Ronald Speirs every time. I think that's the
I'm
bottom line.
yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. I'm assuming the answer is yes to this, but when we were on the tour, Erik had a video, and you must have seen it, of Ronald Speirs being interviewed, and I don't know what it was about it. He's still got the twinkle in his eye. You can still tell he's like a rascal. I don't know. There's something about him that's just like very magnetic, and
Mm-hmm.
you can just kind of see like all the stories. You just think, oh yeah, that's the guy. That's the guy. There's something about his manner. He doesn't sound like I thought he would sound.
Mm.
He's not grizzled or gritty, or he's not got gunslinger eyes or anything. He's just there's just something really enigmatic about him.
Yeah, I when I heard that footage, I thought that he sounded like actor Bill Daniels. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but yeah,
Kind of bears a resemblance as well, apart from like a
yeah,
bald thing
yeah,
about him. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So he played John Adams in 1776, and it really played the dad in The Graduate. Like I thought, wow, he has that sort of New England heavy voice
Yeah, he does. Yeah,
in that regard. So it surprised me as well.
yeah. Um, so how did you research this battle then? I mean, what access did you have? Is that access to the family? Um,
It was a mixture of everything, and our research was complicated by the fact that we were researching and writing it at the height of the pandemic when the world was shut down. And so uh, Erik had been able to acquire a number of Ronald Speirs artifacts and documents for his collection at the Gettysburg Museum of History through the family. Another unexpected but very valuable resource is that Dick Winters kept copies of all of the letters that he wrote back and forth to Ronald Speirs in the 1980s and the 1990s. And so that provided a very valuable glimpse as these two men of very different attitudes were 50 or 60 years onward trying to come to terms not only with what they had done and what they didn't do, but also their newfound celebrity that resulted from
yeah,
both the book and the series Band of Brothers. And I think that's one of the key ingredients of the Ronald Speirs mythos, is that Ronald Speirs, he didn't have a lot of trust in Stephen Ambrose. I think he thought that, oh, can I really trust this guy with my story? And he was very skeptical. And so that meant that Stephen Ambrose had to rely on the recollections of fellow men in Easy Company about Speirs, which were sometimes faulty, second and third hand stories that had passed around, just like we see in the series. And
yeah.
those stories only grew and grew through the passing of time. And so I think that's a huge reason why Speirs is depicted in the manner that he is in the series. And I think it's kind of brilliant cinematically because every one of the so-called massacres or controversial incidents with Speirs, it's presented as a hindsight of hearsay.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
it
one
is.
of the characters, you know, and then there's these flashbacks as the characters are narrating what they heard or what they thought they heard about him.
And sometimes it's weird and sometimes it's not. Yeah, it is very cleverly done.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think it's one of the best cinematic devices in the series. And it most definitely adds this sort of aura to Ronald Speirs. And what Erik and I tried to do is we tried to sift through that a little bit and get to the truth of the matter while balancing out how Speirs has been remembered in popular memory.
What's your favorite Speirs story?
In the series or in real life?
In real life, yeah.
Boy, you know, one of the really fascinating stories that I learned about him is his post-war career,
Right.
particularly his time as one of the Allied commandants at Spandau Prison in the 1950s. That was a fascinating chapter of his life, and it's mentioned in the coda of Band of Brothers. But he talks about it in the filmed interview that you mentioned just a little bit ago.
Yeah.
He was interviewed by a number of newspapers a number of years later in the 1980s of his time at Spandau Prison. His family members remembered some stories that he shared about Spandau Prison as well. And so looking at that and looking at Speirs's career through the lens of the Cold War rather than the Second World War, I think was just a really fascinating episode.
Yeah. 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 An incredible man. And so with the Hang Tough, when you're writing the Dick Winters stuff, is what like? Because I remember John Orloff saying like he was as close to a Superman as we've ever had, like that you could meet. He lands on the night of D-Day, and he's got nothing but a knife, and a few hours later he's taking the guns of Breakhall Manor. Do you know what I mean? It's incredible. Is that the most impressive story about Dick Winters? Or is it just his general leadership? I like it. What impresses me most is how he sustained it throughout the whole war. I think you can be brilliant and brave and incredible once or twice and then burn out. And he just never burn out. He just sustains it for the entire war. And the mental strength to be able to do that is mind blowing to me.
I think, and I'll answer that through Dick Winter's eyes, what he thought his most impressive moment was.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was the Crossroads attack that's depicted in episode 5.
Yeah.
He described that, not necessarily merely about himself, but about the platoons that were with him. He called it the acme of heroism. He said that was our finest moment because it was a constantly evolving situation. We didn't quite have a full picture of everything that was unfolding around us. There was a degree of risk that was
Yeah.
involved in those actions. And how he recounts about it and writes about it later on, he said that he was in a mental state that he had never been in before and he never cared to be in again. He said that he had this almost like a laser focus on the task ahead of him. And it almost seemed surreal to him because it seemed like everything around him was playing out in slow motion. In the series, there's the famous moment where everybody else waits for the red smoke to pop and then they follow him. In reality, Winters was just that much faster a runner than everybody else, and that's why he was so far ahead of them. And as he is running toward that company of Germans, he's thinking in his mind, why can't everybody keep up with me? And so it's
Right.
just this surge of adrenaline combined with a tactical intellect that he had up here that he thought made that his finest moment. And he actually writes to his pen pal, Dieta, who's from Asheville there,
Excellent.
that the Winters actually thought that he might receive the Medal of Honor for that action. He wrote that during the war. That's how high an opinion he had of that action and the actions of his men.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, yeah, we were just at the crossroads actually. It's I mean, when we filmed it, it's not that far. It's about 3 times longer than the set was. I mean, he had a long way to
Yeah.
go in open ground.
Yeah.
It's
But
a heck of a trek.
yeah, when I visited there for the first time, I was just so impressed how well the series did in capturing the look of it. Like, wow, this it looks it's almost identical.
Yeah, I remember going there and it was like, I don't know which way around I'm supposed to say this. It's like art imitating life, life imitating which way. I got there and I
Yeah,
just thought, this looks exactly like the set. And I thought, that's a
yeah,
really stupid thing to say, isn't it? Of course it looks exactly like the set. This is the set. Ours was the fake one. It does.
yeah.
It looks
That's great.
exactly the same. It's very eerie. It's kind of bonkers.
Yeah. No,
Um,
it's a true testament to the production quality.
yes, I agree. So I'll ask you a couple of questions. I've had you for a while now. I don't want to keep you too much
It's
longer.
quite all right.
I read that you were a park ranger at Gettysburg National Park and Harper's Ferry. You're not the guy that whistled at me for having a beer on a rock when I was floating down because I used to tube down Harper's Ferry.
No,
And
no,
were
that
you a
wasn't
park
me.
ranger? Are you sure?
No, I never
Because I've been
yelled
told
at
off by a long park ranger.
I never yelled at inner tubers. No.
You can do it around. It's just okay, excellent. Um, uh, is Gettysburg the source of the beginnings, the origins of the Jared Frederick story as far as being obsessed with history is concerned?
Yes. I had always been interested in history. Uh, I remember the first history books that I bought in kindergarten. I bought a book on George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King Jr. And I still have
Wow.
them. Yeah. And
You must have been popular at kindergarten.
I got along with my classmates fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay, come
um,
on.
but I I was different in that regard though. And on top of that, I always had an interest in cinema
Okay.
in first and second grade. I started watching Turner Classic Movies. I started watching black and white movies when I was in grade school. And I actually sent Jimmy Stewart a birthday card when I was 8 years old. And so all my friends were watching Power Rangers, but I was watching Harvey. And so it was perhaps preordained that I would be merging conversations about history in Hollywood as
Right.
part of my career. But in short, to answer your question, I saw the movie Gettysburg when I was 7 years old. And that astounds people because they think, how could a 4-hour movie keep the attention of a 7-year-old? But it did. And my family took me on a vacation to that park the following summer. And that's when full blown history mode Jared started to emerge. And by the time I was 11 years old, I knew that I wanted to be a historian.
That's incredible. That's great. That's really great. I went up to visit Erik and the museum because he's obviously opening the building next door and expanding the museum and all that business. And I was lucky enough that J.D. Hewitt and Chris Mowry were there, and they definitely didn't give us a guided tour because that's not allowed. But they did do some talking on the battlefield, which was incredible. It was so cool, their knowledge and everything. But getting being there and getting perspective of the battle, I didn't really understand. And I finally understood sort of Pickett's charge, which is just beyond my understanding before that. And how they explain it. It's such a great place to sort of teach history, to actually be there because of the way it's been maintained, and you feel all the geography and everything. And he like Chris, I think it was Chris Mara, I can't remember which one of them made it. JD and Chris were sort of overlapping one another as they were chatting about it, and how I may have got this wrong, but like Lee hits them with the left, then he hits them with the right, and the reason he goes up the middle is because you strengthen your left and you strengthen your right, and then the middle is exposed and you smash up the middle, which is
Precisely.
Napoleonic tactics. The problem is that the opposite general on the Union side was in the same class at the same school and learned the same tactics, which I never really considered before. If you haven't been to Gettysburg, which I'm sure as an American listening, you most probably have, as a place of pilgrimage, but as a European, you should go there because it is a vast battleground and is maintained superbly.
Mm. And it has a lot of hidden World War II history as well.
Yes, some of that was pointed out. Was it, what was it? You tell me because I'll remember it wrong.
Oh, there's many. I just, in fact, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the World War II history of Gettysburg, and I just obtained my doctorate a few months ago. That was the subject. But thank you. In short, there was a German prisoner of war camp. The park was used for military training.
Yep.
The National Cemetery was expanded for World War II dead. They almost scrapped the monuments. They almost recycled them during the war to turn them into wartime material. And then, of course, Dwight Eisenhower purchases a farm there in 1950, and that's the only home that he ever owned in his entire life.
Good place to have it. Wow. Well, what I'm going to do, this has been a great chat, man. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let you go in a minute, but I have to ask you one question. And I always ask this of all my prey. We subhead our podcast The Nearly Men. And looking at your career, I don't think you'll have a nearly story because you've kind of been everything you wanted to be. But is there something you nearly were? Like, did you nearly become a firefighter? Or did you nearly, join the parachute regiment? Or did you nearly become a nurse? Or we, nearly in a Jimmy Stewart film? I don't know.
Well, I almost did become a firefighter, actually. That's before I was determined to become a historian. That is what I wanted to be because I wanted to help people. And right. This wouldn't be allowed today, but I was actually a child volunteer at my local fire department when I was growing up. And I would go in and I would go in and I would help them wash the truck and dry out the hoses and do all of these things around the station. And then I look back on this in shock now. But whenever the alarm rang, they would throw me in the truck and I would actually go to emergencies with them as a 9-year-old. And so they very much treated me as an aspiring firefighter in training. So, but yeah, so your intuition was very correct. I almost did become a firefighter.
Thank you very much. I don't know how I knew that. Something about you made me think you were a firefighter. Well, listen, Jared, it's been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for coming on. Really good luck with the book. We'll put a link onto the podcast. It sounds like the PR for it is sort of writing itself because you've got this great show, Masters of the Air, as well, and everybody's hungry for knowledge about it. So I hope it takes off. I hope it does great. I'll give it a read as well, and I'll do that douchebag in a coffee house review that nobody cares about.
Every
But,
little bit is appreciated.
oh, great. I'll
Yeah.
write a good review.
And
Right.
I will share one more story with you
Yes, please.
before we depart. When Dick Winters was in charge of Easy Company and then the battalion, uh, he very consistently said that I cannot become too attached to these men. I need
Yes.
to treat them with a little bit of distance. But in his letters to Dieta, on more than one occasion, he said, I try to do this, but one there's one paratrooper that I just can't distance myself from because he's just such a good guy. He's a sweet kid. He's a great soldier. Do you know which guy in Easy Company that was?
Is it by any chance Floyd Talbot?
It is.
Wow.
So,
Wow, that's incredible.
and I wasn't sure if you were aware of that, but
I wasn't sure. I wasn't aware.
Winters definitely had his favorites among the enlisted men and the NCOs, and Floyd Talbot was at the top of the list.
Wow. And I'm in Asheville where he used to hang out. It's a good day. It's a good day, my friend.
Cheers.
Buddy, I'll let you go. Cheers to you. I'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming on, Jared.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers, man. Well, that was Jared Frederick. He was a brilliant interview, I think. And I'll wind up as it's just me and not Doug, so we can't do our usual back and forth. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to Jared. That was a really, really great interview. And we will catch you next week. Thank you to all our listeners, our subscribers, and definitely our Patreons. If you haven't subscribed on Patreon, pop over and maybe give us a bit of love on there. Keep us going. Other than that, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Cheers, guys.